December 18th arrived with a chill so sharp it felt like it could slice through bone. The small New England town of Whitlow was blanketed in snow, the streets lined with quaint cottages that seemed pulled straight from a Christmas card. Yet, beneath the idyllic scene, something felt slightly off. It wasn't the weather or the faint hush that always accompanied snowfall. It was the lights. For 3 nights in a row, the Christmas lights strung along Main Street had flickered. Not in the usual way when a bulb burns out, but in a pattern. Locals chalked it up to faulty wiring, but for the more superstitious, it was a warning. Mrs. Hargrove, the oldest resident of Whitlow, swore she could see messages in the flickers. Morse code, she whispered to anyone who'd listen, her eyes darting to the darkened corners of the street. Most people laughed, but there were a few who couldn't shake the unease from her words. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a deep purple hue spread across the sky. Emily and Nathan Porter, a young couple who had recently moved to Whitlow, watched from their living room window. Their cottage was one of the oldest in town, and though they'd loved its charm when they first bought it, Emily had been uneasy since the day they moved in. "It's probably just the snow," Nathan said, noticing Emily's furrowed brow as she stared at the streetlights outside. "Snow messes with electrical stuff sometimes." Emily didn't answer. She was focused on a single string of lights hanging over their porch. They blinked sporadically, casting odd shadows against the walls. At first, she thought it was random, but now it seemed deliberate. She'd been counting the intervals. Later that night, as the couple settled into bed, the power cut out completely. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the frosted windows. Emily sat up, her chest tightening. "Probably just the storm," Nathan muttered, half asleep. Emily slid out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. As she moved through the narrow hallway, the creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath her feet echoed in the stillness. Reaching the living room, she froze. The Christmas tree lights were still on, even though the rest of the house was dark. They blinked slowly, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. She approached the tree cautiously. Each step felt heavier than the last. As she reached out to touch the nearest ornament, the lights suddenly stopped blinking and glowed steady and bright. Then, just as suddenly, they went out completely. A loud knock shattered the silence. It came from the front door. Emily whipped around, her pulse pounding in her ears. She hesitated, then moved toward the door. As she peered through the peephole, she saw nothing but swirling snow. Another knock came, louder this time. "Who's there?" Emily called, her voice trembling. There was no response, but the door began to creak open, despite the fact that it had been deadbolt. Nathan appeared behind her, groggy and confused. "What's going on?" The door swung fully open, revealing nothing but the empty porch. No footprints in the snow, no sign of a visitor. Just the bitter, biting cold that seemed to reach into the house itself. As Nathan stepped outside to investigate, Emily's gaze drifted back to the Christmas tree. The lights blinked once, then twice, in rapid succession. She stared at them, the pattern becoming clear in her mind. It wasn't random. It was spelling something. A single word. Run. The next morning, Whitlow woke to a pristine blanket of fresh snow. The town bustled with holiday preparations, children dragging sleds through the streets, and adults rushing to complete last-minute shopping. Yet, Emily couldn't shake the events of the previous night. As Nathan shoveled the walkway, she stood at the window, sipping her coffee, her eyes fixed on the Christmas tree. The lights were still, their warning message from the night before lingering in her mind. "Did you sleep at all?" Nathan asked as he stepped back inside, brushing snow off his coat. Emily shook her head. "Something's wrong, Nathan. Those lights." "It was probably just a short circuit," he interrupted. "This house is ancient. You know that?" But Emily wasn't convinced. She replayed the scene over and over. The door opening on its own, the message, the oppressive silence that had filled the house afterward. None of it felt like an electrical problem. As the day wore on, Emily tried to distract herself by decorating the house. She hung garlands and arranged candles, but the sense of unease refused to leave. By mid-afternoon, she gave up and went for a walk. The The cold air nipped at her cheeks as she wandered down Main Street, past the flickering town lights. Near the edge of town, Emily spotted something unusual. A figure stood in the snow, just beyond the line of trees that bordered the road. It was a man, tall and motionless, wearing a long black coat. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were watching something only he could see. "Hello," Emily called out, her voice tentative. The man didn't respond. He didn't move. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets around him, but he stood as still as a statue. A chill ran down her spine. When she blinked, he was gone. Emily gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced around frantically, but there was no sign of the man, only untouched snow where he had stood. She backed away slowly, her heart racing, and turned to head home. That night, the power went out again. This time, it wasn't just their house, it was the entire street. Emily and Nathan lit candles and huddled in the living room, the flickering flames casting distorted shadows on the walls. Emily didn't tell Nathan about the man she'd seen. He wouldn't believe her, she reasoned. Around midnight, Emily was startled awake by a loud clattering noise. She nudged Nathan, but he was still sound asleep. Grabbing the flashlight, she crept out of bed and into the hallway. The noise was coming from the kitchen. As she approached, she noticed something strange. The air smelled faintly of pine and something metallic, like old pennies. When she turned the corner, her heart nearly stopped. The back door was wide open and snow was blowing inside. On the kitchen table sat a single object, a snow globe. It wasn't hers. Emily's hands trembled as she picked it up. Inside the globe was a tiny replica of their house, down to the wreath on the door and the flickering Christmas lights. As she shook it gently, snow swirled inside, but the scene remained eerily static. She set the globe down and hurried to close the door. When she turned back around, the snow globe was gone. "Emily?" Nathan's groggy voice called from the hallway. She spun around to see him standing there, rubbing his eyes. "What are you doing?" She stopped herself, her words caught in her throat. Nathan wouldn't understand. He didn't feel it, that sense of being watched. Instead, she whispered, "Nothing. Go back to bed." But as Nathan walked away, Emily stayed rooted in place, her eyes darting to the table where the snow globe had been. Her mind raced with questions. Who had left it? Why? And what did it mean? In the silence, she thought she heard a faint noise. A laugh, high-pitched and brittle, like the crackling of ice underfoot. It was coming from somewhere outside. The morning brought no answers, only more questions. Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at her coffee cup. She had barely slept, the strange laugh echoing in her mind like a taunting refrain. Nathan had already left for work, brushing off her unease as pre-holiday jitters. The house felt oppressively silent in his absence, the kind of quiet that made every creak of the floorboards sound like a scream. Emily's eyes wandered to the front door, where the wreath she had hung days ago swayed gently. The motion seemed odd. There was no draft in the house, and the windows were all shut tight against the bitter cold. Setting down her coffee, she stood and walked over, her slippers padding softly against the floor. As she reached the door, the wreath stopped moving. It hung there, innocuous and still, its pine needles dusted with fake snow. But something caught her eye, a small ribbon, red as blood, tied around one of the branches. She hadn't put it there. Emily hesitated before reaching out. Her fingers brushed against the ribbon, and she felt an unnatural chill seep into her skin. Pulling it free, she turned it over in her hands. A single word was scrawled on the ribbon in what looked like ink, though its texture was thick and slightly sticky. "Listen." Her breath caught in her throat. A wave of dizziness washed over her, but she forced herself to steady. Holding the ribbon tightly, she stepped back from the door. The house seemed darker somehow, even though sunlight streamed through the windows. Emily didn't know what to do. Should she call Nathan? The police? What could she even say? That someone left a ribbon on her wreath? It sounded ridiculous. Yet, deep down, she knew it wasn't ridiculous at all. The day passed in a blur of half-finished tasks and constant glances at the front door. The ribbon sat on the counter, its presence an unwelcome reminder of the unknown. By the time the sun began to set, Emily's nerves were frayed. Then the whispers started. At first, they were so faint she thought she was imagining them. A low, murmuring sound like voices carried on the wind. She paused in the middle of washing dishes, her hands submerged in soapy water, and tilted her head to listen. The sound was coming from the front door. Her pulse quickened as she walked toward it. The whispers grew louder with each step, their cadence rhythmic, almost like a chant. She pressed her ear to the door, her heart pounding. The words were garbled, but she could make out fragments. Not safe, he watches. Christmas Eve. A sudden, loud knock made her stumble back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The whispers stopped immediately, replaced by a heavy silence. Emily stared at the door, her mind racing. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. There was no answer. Summoning her courage, she unlocked the door and yanked it open. The cold air rushed in, biting at her skin. No one was there, but on the porch lay another ribbon, identical to the first. This one bore a different word: run. Emily slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands trembling. She backed away slowly, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. The whispers returned, fainter now, as if mocking her from a distance. Desperate for answers, Emily grabbed her phone and called Nathan. The line rang once, twice, and then went dead. She tried again, but the screen displayed no signal. She was alone, cut off, and vulnerable. That night, as darkness enveloped the house, Emily sat in the living room. Every light in the house turned on. The Christmas tree glowed softly, its light steady for the first time in days. She tried to convince herself it was just a prank, some cruel joke played by an unseen neighbor. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the work of any human. As midnight approached, she heard the faint sound of bells. Not the cheerful jingle of holiday carols, but something deeper, darker. They rang out in slow, deliberate tones, each one reverberating through her chest. The whispers began again, louder this time, coming from all around her. She clutched the ribbon in her hand, its message clear and chilling. Emily knew she wasn't alone in the house anymore. The ringing bells echoed into the depths of the night, each toll wrapping around Emily like an icy chain. She sat frozen on the couch, her knuckles white as they gripped the armrest. Her gaze darted to the front door, half expecting it to burst open, but it remained eerily still. The whispers, now louder than ever, swirled around her like a spectral choir. Emily's first instinct was to run. But where? The streets were deserted, and with the fresh snow, it would be easy to lose her way, or worse, leave a trail for whatever was toying with her. Instead, she forced herself to stand, her legs shaky, and moved toward the kitchen. She needed a weapon, something to defend herself against whatever had invaded her home. The whispers followed her, low and guttural, the words incomprehensible, yet laced with malice. In the drawer, she found a butcher knife. The weight of it in her hand brought a small measure of comfort. Emily pressed her back against the wall, scanning the dimly lit kitchen. The Christmas tree's glow spilled faintly into the room, but the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if alive. Then came the knock. It wasn't a loud, urgent pounding, but a slow, deliberate rapping, like a visitor who knew they would be invited in. Emily's heart leapt into her throat. The sound came from the back door this time, the one that had been mysteriously left open the night before. "Who's there?" She managed to choke out, her voice trembling. No response came, only another knock, 3 sharp taps that seemed to reverberate through the entire house. Summoning what courage she had left, Emily crept toward the door, the knife clutched tightly in her hand. The whispers quieted, as though they were holding their breath, watching her every move. She reached the door and peered through the frosted glass. A figure stood just beyond the threshold, shrouded in shadow. It wasn't the tall man she had seen before, but someone or something smaller. The figure wore a hooded cloak, the fabric a deep crimson that stood out starkly against the snow. "Go away!" Emily shouted, her voice breaking. The figure didn't move. Instead, it reached into its cloak and pulled out a small object, holding it up for her to see. Through the haze of frost, Emily recognized it instantly: the snow globe. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the miniature replica of her house. The figure raised its free hand and tapped the glass, the sound unnaturally loud and sharp, like a crack of thunder. Emily stumbled back, her grip on the knife faltering. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. In an instant, the figure vanished. Emily blinked, her vision swimming, and when she looked again, the porch was empty. The snow globe was gone. She locked the door and backed away, her mind racing. The whispers returned, louder than ever, seeming to come from every corner of the house. Emily fled to the living room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She glanced at the Christmas tree, the lights flickering erratically once more. That's when she saw it, a figure standing in the reflection of the ornaments, watching her. Spinning around, she raised the knife, but the room was empty. Her chest heaved as she fought to catch her breath. She looked back at the ornaments, and the figure was still there, its head tilted slightly, as if amused. The lights on the tree blinked out, plunging the room into darkness. Emily screamed as a cold wind rushed through the house, extinguishing every candle and leaving her in suffocating blackness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then came the voice, soft and chilling, a whisper in her ear. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Emily's scream tore through the night as the bells began to ring again. Emily woke to silence, though she had no memory of falling asleep. She was still on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't hers, a patchwork quilt, faded and frayed at the edges. Her knife lay on the floor nearby, its blade dull and cold. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights now steady but dim, casting long, skeletal shadows across the walls. Her first thought was that it had been a nightmare, some fevered hallucination brought on by stress. But the memories were too vivid. The whispers, the figure at the back door, the voice that had whispered in her ear. And then there was the quilt. She hadn't owned anything like it. She stood, her body aching as if she had been running for miles. Outside, the morning sun glinted off the snow, the world deceptively serene. Emily approached the window cautiously, half expecting to see something lurking in the yard. But there was only the snow, pristine and undisturbed. Her gaze drifted to the snowman. It was still there, but something was different. Its twig arms had been repositioned, now raised as if waving. The scarf she had wrapped around its neck hung lower, revealing a wide, jagged grin carved into its face. Emily's stomach churned as she realized the grin hadn't been there before. She grabbed her phone, desperate to call Nathan, but the signal was still gone. Frustration and fear bubbled inside her as she stared at the snowman, its frozen grin mocking her from the yard. Deciding she couldn't stay in the house another minute, Emily threw on her coat and boots. She needed to leave, to find anyone, who could help her make sense of what was happening. But as she stepped outside, she froze. Footprints, dozens of them crisscrossed the yard, leading to and from the house. They were small, like those of a child, but they didn't stop at the snowman or the porch. They formed a chaotic web, as though someone or something had been circling her home all night. Emily's breath came in sharp gasps as she followed the tracks, her boots crunching in the snow. The footprints led to the base of the snowman, where they stopped abruptly. She knelt to inspect them, her fingers brushing against the snow. The cold bit at her skin, but she didn't care. Something caught her eye, a glint of metal buried in the snow. She reached for it, pulling out a small object that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the same snow globe the cloaked figure had shown her, but now it was cracked, a jagged fissure running down its glass surface. Inside, the miniature version of her house was intact, but something was wrong. A tiny figure stood in the yard, positioned next to the snowman. It was a perfect replica of Emily, down to the red scarf she wore. She dropped the snow globe as though it had burned her. It hit the ground but didn't break further, instead rolling to rest at the base of the snowman. The carved grin seemed wider now, more sinister. Emily stumbled back, her mind racing. This wasn't normal. It wasn't natural. She needed to leave, but as she turned toward her car, she stopped cold. The windshield was frosted over, but something was scrawled across it in jagged lines. She stepped closer, dread pooling in her stomach as she read the words etched into the ice. "You can't run." Her car keys felt heavy in her pocket, but she knew they were useless. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to get away. But where could she go? The town felt a million miles away, and even if she reached it, what would she say? That her snowman was smiling at her? That a snow globe was haunting her? As she stood there, paralyzed, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound. It was the laughter again, high-pitched and childlike, but tinged with malice. Emily whipped around, scanning the yard, but she saw nothing. The laughter grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround her. She ran back into the house, slamming the door shut behind her. The moment she locked it, the whispers began again, faint but insistent. Emily pressed her back against the door, clutching her coat tightly. Her eyes darted to the snow globe, which now sat on the windowsill, as though it had been placed there deliberately. The figure inside was gone. She stared at the empty yard through the window, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. The snowman's grin was still there, wide and menacing, a promise of horrors yet to come. Emily realized she was trapped, caught in a nightmare that wouldn't end. And Christmas Eve was still days away. The hours crawled by in agonizing silence. Emily stayed by the window, the snow globe perched like a silent sentinel on the sill. She couldn't bear to touch it again, its cracked surface a reminder of the surreal nightmare unfolding around her. Outside, the snowman loomed, its grin seeming to grow wider as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, chilling shadows across the yard. Emily tried to keep herself busy, desperate to distract her racing mind. She turned on the television, but the static on every channel was worse than the silence. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the house settling were her only companions. Yet, even those sounds felt alive, as though the house itself were breathing. Then came the voices. They began faintly, like murmurs slipping through cracks in the walls. At first, Emily thought it was the wind, but as she leaned closer, pressing her ear against the plaster, the whispers became clearer. Dozens of voices spoke at once, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. She couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, accusing, malevolent. Emily recoiled, clutching her chest as her breathing quickened. The voices seemed to follow her, growing louder as she moved through the house. They echoed down the hallway, spilling into every room, filling every corner with their sinister cadence. Panicked, she grabbed her phone, praying the signal had returned. She dialed Nathan's number, but the call wouldn't connect. The screen flickered, and for a moment, she swore she saw her reflection staring back at her. Not her usual self, but a distorted, hollow version with sunken eyes and a twisted grin. She threw the phone down, her heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by soft thuds within the walls, like something was moving just out of sight. Emily grabbed the knife from the kitchen and pressed herself against the counter, her mind teetering on the edge of hysteria. "Stop it!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Leave me alone!" The house fell silent, the abrupt stillness almost deafening. Emily's chest heaved as she waited, every muscle in her body tense. Then a single voice broke the quiet, clear and chilling. "We're inside." Emily's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from the walls. It was behind her. She spun around, knife raised, but the kitchen was empty. The lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows that danced across the room. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Emily flinched, the sound reverberating through her skull. Against her better judgment, she crept toward the staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied, as though urging her to turn back. When she reached the top, she hesitated. The hallway stretched before her, its shadows unnaturally long. The door to her bedroom was ajar, and beyond it, a soft, flickering light spilled out. Clutching the knife tighter, Emily pushed the door open. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside. The room was lit by the glow of dozens of candles, their flames wavering as though disturbed by an unseen breeze. In the center of the room sat the snow globe, perfectly intact, its cracked surface somehow repaired. The figure inside was back, but it wasn't alone. A second figure stood next to it, a tiny replica of the cloaked stranger. Emily stumbled backward, nearly dropping the knife. The closet door creaked open behind her, and she spun around, her pulse hammering in her ears. From the darkness emerged a hand, small, pale, and impossibly thin. It reached out toward her, the fingers trembling as though struggling to break free of the void. Emily screamed, slashing at the air with the knife. The hand retreated, and the closet door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The whispers ceased, leaving only her ragged breathing and the faint crackle of candle flames. She backed out of the room, her gaze locked on the closet door. As she turned to flee, the candles snuffed out, plunging the house into darkness. The air grew colder, the oppressive silence broken only by a single, chilling sound. The snow globe chimed. It wasn't a cheerful melody but a slow, haunting tune, each note reverberating through the house like a death knell. Emily ran down the stairs, tears streaming down her face. She reached the living room and froze. The snow globe was back on the windowsill, its glow casting eerie patterns across the walls. The figure inside had moved again, now standing at the base of the miniature snowman, its hand outstretched. The snow globe chimed once more, the sound lingering in the air like a ghostly echo. Emily collapsed onto the couch, the knife slipping from her grasp. She whispered to herself, over and over, a desperate mantra. It's not real. It's not real. But deep down, she knew the truth. Whatever this was, it was real, and it wasn't done with her yet. The snow globe's haunting chime lingered in Emily's ears long after it stopped. She sat motionless on the couch, staring at the cursed object on the windowsill. The house was quiet again, but it was the kind of silence that felt alive, charged with anticipation, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She couldn't stay here any longer. Grabbing her coat, she bolted for the front door, only to find it wouldn't budge. The knob twisted uselessly in her hands, as if the lock had jammed. She yanked and pulled, her desperation mounting, but the door remained stubbornly shut. Even the windows, which she tried next, refused to open. It was as if the house itself had decided to keep her trapped. Her chest tightened, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She tried to calm herself, pacing the living room, but her steps felt heavier with every lap. The air grew colder, seeping through her clothes and into her bones. That's when she noticed them. Markings on the walls, faint but unmistakable. Emily leaned closer, running her trembling fingers over the etchings. They looked like symbols crudely carved into the plaster, forming an erratic pattern that snaked around the room. She didn't remember seeing them before, and as she inspected the walls further, she realized they weren't limited to the living room. The symbols were everywhere, in the kitchen, the hallway, even the stairs leading to the second floor. Some were deep, as if gouged with a blade, while others were faint, almost imperceptible. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she traced their jagged lines. They seemed ancient, alien, as if they didn't belong in this world. The markings led her back to the snow globe. Her eyes widened as she noticed something she hadn't before. The base of the globe was now covered in similar symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. She reached out to touch it but stopped herself, remembering the strange visions it had already shown her. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a barely noticeable change, but it grew stronger, a pressure that pressed down on her chest and made it hard to breathe. The whispering began again, this time louder and more distinct. "Look closer," the voices urged, their tones varying from soft and seductive to harsh and commanding. Emily clenched her fists, resisting the pull of their words, but her gaze was drawn to the globe despite herself. Inside, the miniature scene had changed again. The cloaked figure was now pointing directly at her, its face still hidden, but its posture accusatory. The snow swirled faster, almost violently, and she could swear the walls of the globe were starting to crack under the strain. Then the lights flickered, and with a final, gut-wrenching hum, the electricity went out entirely. Darkness enveloped the house, save for the faint glow of the snow globe and the ethereal shimmer of the markings on the walls. Emily stumbled backward, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled to retrieve it, her fingers clumsy with fear. When she looked at the screen, her stomach dropped. A text message blinked on the display, but it wasn't from any number she recognized. "They're coming. Midnight." She stared at the message, her mind racing. Who was they? What was happening at midnight? Before she could process it, the phone buzzed again, another message appearing below the first. "Look outside." Emily's hands shook as she turned toward the window. The snowman was gone. In its place stood three figures, cloaked and hooded, their faces obscured. They were perfectly still, like statues, but their presence was suffocating, filling her with an inexplicable dread. The snow globe chimed once more, the sound sharp and deliberate, like a warning bell. Emily backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. Midnight was only a few hours away, and she was trapped in a house that seemed alive, marked with symbols she couldn't understand, haunted by forces she couldn't see. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent now, echoing through her skull. "Prepare," they said over and over, their voices rising in a chaotic crescendo. "Prepare." Emily dropped to her knees, covering her ears, but the voices only grew louder, drowning out her thoughts. She looked up at the snow globe, its glow intensifying, and realized with chilling certainty that whatever was coming, there was no escaping it. And then, as if to drive the point home, the front door unlocked itself with a resounding click. Emily's trembling hand reached for the doorknob, but she hesitated. The echoing click still hung in the air, as though the house itself were daring her to leave. For the briefest moment, she considered staying, retreating deeper into the house and barricading herself away from whatever awaited her outside. But the whispers in the walls wouldn't stop. They slithered through the cracks, crawling into her ears, their maddening repetition urging her to open the door. "Prepare," they hissed. "It's time." With a deep breath, Emily turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a world drenched in an eerie, otherworldly glow. The snow was no longer pristine white, but a sickly shade of gray, as if tainted by ash. The figures she'd seen earlier were gone, leaving only faint impressions in the snow where their feet had been. Yet the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered, heavier than ever. She stepped onto the porch, the chill cutting through her like knives. The air smelled strange, metallic, and faintly sweet, like decaying fruit. The snow crunched beneath her boots, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Her breath formed clouds in front of her, but they dissipated unnaturally fast, as though the cold air itself was devouring them. The snow globe was in her pocket, its weight like a stone dragging her down. She'd brought it with her instinctively, as though it were a talisman or a key to understanding what was happening. She felt its glassy surface press against her leg with every step, its faint warmth incongruous with the freezing night. She wandered into the yard, her eyes darting between the shadows. The symbols that had been etched into the house's walls were now carved into the trees, glowing faintly against the bark. They seemed to pulse in time with her racing heart, their jagged lines shifting and twisting when she wasn't looking directly at them. A faint sound reached her ears, barely audible over the crunch of her footsteps. It was a soft humming, low and melodic, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't inviting either. It was a sound that simply existed, uncaring and ancient. Against her better judgment, Emily followed it. The farther she walked, the more surreal her surroundings became. The trees leaned inward, their branches tangling overhead to form a natural archway. The snow seemed to glow faintly beneath her feet, illuminating her path. She had the unsettling sense that she wasn't walking on the forest floor at all, but on some suspended plane just above it. Finally, she reached a clearing. At its center stood a large, circular mirror mounted on an ornate wooden frame. It looked impossibly old, its surface warped and clouded with age. The symbols she'd seen throughout the house and forest were etched into the frame, their lines glowing faintly, as if the mirror itself were alive. The humming was louder here, emanating from the mirror's surface. Emily's reflection stared back at her, but something was off. Her reflection wasn't mirroring her movements. Instead, it stood completely still, watching her with an expression that didn't match the fear she felt. It was calm, almost serene, its eyes darker than they should have been. The snow globe in her pocket grew warmer, almost burning hot. She pulled it out and held it up to the mirror. The reflection didn't mimic this action. Instead, the Emily in the glass tilted her head and smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched far too wide. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed from the mirror. It wasn't the whispers from before. This voice was singular, powerful, and commanding. "The door is open, Emily. Will you step through?" Her reflection extended a hand, pressing its palm against the glass. For a brief moment, Emily thought she saw movement behind her double, a swirling darkness, like a storm trapped in the mirror's surface. Her heart pounded, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her feet were rooted in place. She clutched the snow globe tightly, its warmth now searing. The voice spoke again, quieter this time, but no less commanding. "Decide, Emily. Midnight approaches." And as the words faded, the reflection began to change. Its serene face twisted into something monstrous, its eyes glowing like embers. The storm behind it surged forward, and the glass of the mirror began to crack. Emily stumbled backward, clutching the snow globe as the cracks in the mirror spread like spiderwebs. The storm within it raged, flashes of dark, swirling shadows pressing against the glass as if desperate to escape. Her reflection, now grotesque and unrecognizable, banged its hands against the inside of the mirror, its mouth open in a silent scream. The humming from before was gone, replaced by an ominous rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The symbols carved into the mirror's frame flared bright, casting sharp shadows across the clearing. Emily felt the heat of the snow globe intensify, its glow leaking between her fingers like molten light. "Don't look away," the commanding voice from the mirror warned, though it sounded fractured now, layered with whispers. "You must face what's been waiting for you." Emily's instinct was to run, to flee back into the woods, but her body betrayed her. She stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear her gaze from the mirror. Slowly, the storm on the other side began to take shape. At first, it was indistinct, shifting masses of shadow and light. But then, figures emerged. They were familiar, yet impossible to recognize, like memories half forgotten and distorted by time. A young girl with hollow eyes, clutching a tattered doll. An older man with a weathered face, his expression frozen in anguish. And finally, a woman whose face sent a chill through Emily's very soul. She was looking at her own mother. Emily's knees buckled, but she caught herself before falling. Her mother, who had disappeared nearly 20 years ago, stood in the mirror, her expression a mix of sorrow and warning. The storm raged around her, but she remained still, her gaze locked onto Emily's. "Mom?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out toward the mirror, her fingers brushing against its icy surface. The reflection of her mother raised a hand to meet hers, their palms separated only by the barrier of the glass. "Emily." Her mother's voice came softly, layered with static and distortion, but unmistakably hers. "You've come so far, but you need to leave now. They're watching." "Who's watching? What is this place?" Emily demanded, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to pull her mother through the glass, to break the barrier and finally have answers. But her mother shook her head, her image flickering as the cracks in the mirror deepened. "You shouldn't have taken it," she said, her voice growing fainter. "The snow globe, return it, before it's too late." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the storm surged forward again, swallowing her mother's image. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, shards of glass flying outward. She shielded her face with her arms, the snow globe tumbling from her grasp and landing in the snow with a dull thud. When the noise subsided, Emily lowered her arms. The mirror was gone. In its place stood the three cloaked figures she had seen earlier, their forms unnaturally still. They seemed to absorb the dim light around them, their presence oppressive and suffocating. One of them stepped forward, its hood falling back to reveal a face devoid of features, smooth and blank like a mannequin. It raised an elongated hand, pointing directly at the snow globe lying in the snow. "Choose," it said, its voice a hollow echo. Emily's heart raced as she glanced between the snow globe and the figures. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind, but she couldn't ignore the weight of the command in the air. The clearing felt smaller, the trees pressing in as the figures loomed closer. She bent down, hesitating before picking up the snow globe. It was no longer warm. It was ice cold, the frost seeping into her palm. As her fingers closed around it, the cloaked figures stopped moving, their heads tilting as though observing her decision. The one with the blank face spoke again, its voice reverberating in her skull. "The path is set. Midnight waits for no one." Before Emily could respond, the clearing dissolved around her, the world spinning into darkness. She clung to the snow globe, its cold surface the only anchor in the chaos. And then, as suddenly as it began, the spinning stopped, and she found herself back in the living room of the house. The mirror was gone, but the whispers remained. Emily's surroundings were indistinguishable from the house she had fled earlier, but something felt different. The air was thick, saturated with an oppressive stillness. The floorboards beneath her creaked, as if groaning under some unbearable burden. She stood in the living room, the faint glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The snow globe, now cold and heavy in her palm, seemed to pulse with a quiet, unearthly rhythm. She took a deep breath, but it didn't help. The air was too thick with something she couldn't place, and the silence stretched like an endless void. Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The mirror had shattered, but the sense of dread hadn't disappeared. In fact, it seemed to have grown more pronounced, as though it had seeped into the very walls of the house. The figures in the woods, her mother's voice, the warning, all of it was still there, swirling in her mind like a storm that wouldn't pass. She didn't know who or what the cloaked figures were, but their words were etched into her memory. The path is set. Midnight waits for no one. What did that mean? And more importantly, what was she supposed to do with the snow globe? She couldn't shake the feeling that the house, this place, was somehow tied to her past. It wasn't just the ghostly echoes of her mother's warning, nor the persistent whispers that clawed at the edges of her thoughts. It was the house itself. Every crack in the walls, every floorboard creak, every gust of cold air. It was as if it knew her. It had been waiting for her. Emily's eyes flicked to the hallway, where the door leading to the basement stood slightly ajar. The door she had never noticed before. She knew, deep in her bones, that something awaited her down there. But she couldn't move. The weight of the snow globe in her hand was more than just physical. It felt as though the very universe had decided her fate, and it was a weight she could not escape. She tried to steady her breathing. Focus, she told herself. She needed to think. Her mother's warning echoed once more. You shouldn't have taken it. The snow globe had clearly played a role in all of this, but what exactly was its purpose? Why had it drawn her to this place? Emily had never believed in the supernatural, but the events she had witnessed in the past hours were undeniable. Whatever force had set these events in motion, she was its unwilling participant. Her gaze shifted to the small table near the window, where the remnants of the storm outside could be seen, snow swirling unnaturally in the wind. It was the same unnatural cold, the same eerie silence. There was something about the storm that seemed wrong, out of place. But what caught her attention was the reflection in the window, her own face staring back at her. But it wasn't her face. The reflection of her face was smiling, no, grinning, at her. A wide, too wide smile that stretched across her face, pulling at the corners of her mouth in a grotesque mimicry of joy. Her eyes, once filled with terror, were now vacant. Cold, the reflection blinked at her, but not in the way she did. It was too slow, as if it were watching her, studying her every move. Emily stumbled backward, dropping the snow globe. It hit the floor with a soft thud, but the sound was wrong, hollow, as if the air had somehow absorbed the impact. Her reflection in the window did not mirror her movements. Instead, it remained frozen, still grinning, the smile widening with each passing second. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The reflection's smile seemed to stretch farther, distorting, as if it were breaking apart at the seams. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, as though they were alive and watching her every move. And then, the room grew colder than it had ever been before. The temperature plummeted, and Emily could see her breath fogging in front of her. She ran for the door, but as she reached for the handle, a voice boomed from somewhere within the house. "You cannot escape," it said, deep and resonant. It was a voice she had heard before, but couldn't place. It was everywhere. It was in the walls, in the air, in her head. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, the ground warping as if reality itself was bending. The door to the hallway slammed shut in front of her, sealing her inside the room. Emily's pulse quickened as the shadows in the corners of the room began to move, slowly at first, then faster, swirling like smoke. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they merged into one single, deafening sound. A voice. "Return it." The words were a command, a demand, and Emily knew she had no choice but to obey. She looked down at the snow globe, lying forgotten on the floor. Its surface shimmered as if beckoning her. She reached for it, her hand shaking. When she picked it up, the temperature of the room seemed to stabilize slightly, but the sense of unease only deepened. She didn't understand. Return it where? The figure of her mother flashed briefly in her mind, her warning fading into the shadows. Emily turned toward the door. The hallway was waiting. Emily's hand trembled around the snow globe, its surface still cold despite the unsettling warmth in the house. She could feel the weight of its presence in her palm, like a heavy decision waiting to be made. The whispered command still echoed in her ears, "Return it." But to where? The house was a labyrinth, its corners dark and unfathomable, and she was no closer to understanding what had drawn her here. She stood motionless in front of the door leading to the hallway, her thoughts racing as she stared at the walls, their surfaces alive with shadows that seemed to pulse with every breath she took. The floor beneath her feet creaked, as though the house itself were aware of her every movement. The air felt thick, suffocating. She had to act, but the uncertainty gnawed at her insides like an unshakable fear. Emily glanced down at the snow globe again, its swirling frost now moving with an unnatural fluidity. It seemed to beckon her, but also warn her, as though the globe itself were aware of the power it held. A strange sensation washed over her, something between curiosity and dread. There was no escaping it. The globe was tied to her fate, and whatever lay ahead was inevitable. With a deep, shaky breath, Emily turned away from the door and began walking toward the staircase that led to the basement. Her footsteps were too loud, too heavy, echoing through the silence. As she descended into the dim light of the basement, the temperature dropped further, and the chill of the space seemed to settle deep within her bones. The air smelled stale, a mixture of mildew and something darker, something ancient. The basement was small, barely more than a room, but it felt vast in its emptiness. The walls were lined with old, dust-covered shelves, filled with forgotten relics of another time. The floor was cracked and uneven, the stones worn down by years of neglect. Yet, in the far corner of the room, a heavy wooden chest stood out. It was covered in dust, but there was a strange gleam to its surface, as if it had been waiting for her arrival. Emily's eyes fixed on the chest, her heartbeat quickening. She didn't need to be told. She knew this was where the snow globe needed to go. But why? And how? The answers were elusive, shrouded in the same shadows that seemed to follow her. Her hand, still clutching the globe, shook as she walked toward the chest. Every step felt like a weight pressing her down, a force that seemed to resist her every move. When she reached the chest, she hesitated. The air around her seemed to thicken, the whispers louder now, the voices blending into one continuous hum. They were impatient, urging her to act, to make her choice. Emily took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. She had no choice. She placed the snow globe carefully on the chest, its cool surface glinting in the dim light. The moment it touched the wood, a shock ran through her, like an electric current. The chest creaked, its heavy lid lifting slightly as though some unseen force were guiding it. Emily stepped back, her mind racing, heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something ancient and powerful. The lid of the chest opened fully, revealing a dark void within. It was as though the chest itself were a doorway to something far beyond the confines of the basement. The air seemed to ripple, distorting like heat waves rising from the ground. Emily stared into the void, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. In the darkness, something stirred. A low, rumbling sound emanated from within, and Emily took an instinctive step back. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. The snow globe, now placed on the chest, began to glow with an eerie, otherworldly light. The frost inside it twisted and spun, faster now, as if the globe were reacting to the presence within the chest. The voices grew louder, swirling around her in a cacophony of whispers. They were no longer just whispers. They were commands, urgent and insistent. Open it, they demanded. Release what's inside. But Emily didn't want to. She couldn't. The fear in her chest tightened, but her hand reached out, as if against her will, and she grasped the lid of the chest. The moment she touched it, the room seemed to bend, the walls warping and stretching as though the fabric of reality itself was being torn apart. A bright light erupted from the chest, blinding her. For a brief moment, Emily felt herself pulled toward it, as if the force inside was calling to her, urging her to surrender. But something within her snapped. With every ounce of willpower she had left, Emily wrenched herself away from the chest. The light flickered, then vanished, leaving only the darkness and the faint glow of the snow globe. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she staggered back, her body shaking from the encounter. The chest was still open, its contents hidden in the shadows. She turned and fled from the basement, slamming the door behind her. The house seemed to breathe with her, its walls shifting as if it were alive. The weight of the snow globe in her hand felt heavier now, its coldness seeping into her skin. Emily didn't know what she had just unleashed, but she knew one thing for certain: whatever it wasn't over. The real terror was just beginning. Emily's breath came in ragged bursts as she stumbled back into the hallway, the snow globe still gripped tightly in her hand. The basement door slammed shut behind her with an unnatural force, rattling the house. The sound echoed down the empty corridors, and for a moment, Emily stood still, frozen in place. The darkness around her felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Every shadow seemed to whisper, a soft hum that made her skin crawl. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Emily had come to this house to escape, to find peace. She had left behind a life that had been filled with loss, betrayal, and fear, hoping that this isolated place would offer solace. But instead, she had uncovered something far worse than she had ever imagined. The snow globe, that cursed object, was tied to something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. But what? And why had she been chosen? As she stood in the hallway, trying to steady her breath, the whispers intensified. They were no longer just in her ears. They were inside her mind, worming their way into her thoughts, urging her to return to the chest. They called to her relentlessly, their voices growing louder, more insistent. Return it. The command was clear, impossible to ignore. She glanced down at the globe, its glass surface now shimmering with an eerie light. The frost inside continued to swirl, moving faster than before. It was as if the globe was alive, reacting to something unseen. Emily could feel a magnetic pull, a force stronger than her own will, urging her to act. The questions that had plagued her since the moment she had first entered the house. What was this place? What was the chest hiding? seemed to push forward, demanding answers. With a heavy heart, Emily made the decision. She had to return to the basement. She had to confront whatever lay within the chest. The path she had chosen felt inevitable, as though it had already been written. Every step she took toward the door felt like a step further into the unknown, deeper into the house's dark heart. But as she reached for the basement door, something stopped her. It wasn't the door itself. No, it was something far worse. The house had shifted again. The hallway, once familiar, had transformed. The walls seemed to ripple and stretch, like a canvas pulled out of shape. The floor beneath her feet felt uneven, as though she were walking on a shifting surface. She reached out to steady herself against the wall, only to find that the texture had changed. The familiar wallpaper was gone, replaced by a strange, slick surface, smooth, almost organic. The air, too, had changed. It felt thick, suffocating, as though she were walking through a fog that clung to her skin. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she wondered if she had imagined the transformation. But when she blinked, the hallway remained the same, twisted, foreign. The feeling that she was no longer in control of her surroundings gripped her tightly. The whispers were louder now, their words clearer. "Return it. Open the chest." Emily's pulse quickened as she realized something far worse than she had anticipated was happening. The house was shifting around her, adapting to the force within the snow globe. She had not just disturbed something, it was using her. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, pulled deeper into the house's web. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her back toward the basement door. She no longer had a choice in the matter. The door seemed to call to her, its handle inviting her to open it once again. But as her hand gripped the cold metal, a new thought struck her. The chest in the basement was no longer just a mystery. It was the key to something much larger. The snow globe wasn't just a relic. It was a beacon, calling forth something dark and ancient, something that had been buried for far too long. The door creaked open before she could touch the handle fully, the same eerie sound filling the space. Emily stepped back, her mind screaming for her to turn around, to leave. But she couldn't. She had come too far. The door opened wider on its own, revealing a new version of the basement, one that she had never seen before. The shadows in the room were deeper, darker than they had ever been. The chest still sat in the corner, but now it seemed different. It was larger, its surface smoother, almost polished, and the air around it pulsed with an energy that made Emily's skin tingle. She knew that the answers she sought were inside, but she also knew that opening the chest might be a mistake. It felt like a trap. The whispers urged her forward, growing more desperate. With every fiber of her being, Emily wanted to turn and run. But the pull of the globe in her hand was undeniable. The shadows inside the chest seemed to reach out, calling her name in a voice she could almost recognize. There was no escape now. She was bound to this place, bound to the globe, bound to whatever was hidden in the chest. As she stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, Emily realized that she was no longer making the decision. The house was guiding her, and the truth she had feared would soon be revealed. The return was not just the act of putting the globe back. It was the beginning of something far darker. Emily's fingers trembled as she approached the chest. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. The air had grown colder, and she could feel the weight of every moment pressing down on her. The whispers were relentless now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to swirl around her, urging her forward. "Open it! You must open it!" There was no longer any room for hesitation. She was no longer in control of her own actions. The chest, the globe, the house, they had all conspired to bring her here. As she knelt in front of the chest, the snow globe still clutched tightly in her hand, she could feel its power reverberating through her fingertips. She had been so focused on the chest, on the compulsion to open it, that she hadn't truly stopped to consider the full implications of what she was doing. The house was alive. It wasn't just a collection of walls and rooms. It was something sentient, something that had been waiting for her. For reasons she couldn't yet understand, she was its vessel. With a deep breath, she set the snow globe on the floor beside her and reached for the latch of the chest. The moment her fingers made contact with it, The house seemed to exhale, a low, groaning sound reverberating through the walls. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the very act of unlocking the chest had set something in motion. Emily hesitated. She wanted to stop, to flee, but the house had already woven its spell around her. She was bound to this place, to this moment, and there was no going back. The lid of the chest creaked open slowly, as though resisting the inevitable. The air in the room thickened, and Emily could taste the sharpness of fear on her tongue. The shadows inside the chest seemed to shift and move, as though they were alive, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. She swallowed hard, but it felt like a lifetime before she could bring herself to look inside. What had she awakened? What had she uncovered? As her eyes finally fell upon the contents of the chest, she gasped. Inside was not just the relics or trinkets she had imagined, but a strange, ancient tome. Its cover was blackened, scorched as though it had been burned and reborn. The pages inside were yellowed, curling at the edges, and the writing was in a language that she did not recognize. There was a heavy presence around the book, a palpable sense of dread that made her stomach turn. This wasn't a normal book. It was something far darker, far more dangerous. As Emily's hand hovered over the tome, she felt the temperature drop even further, and a coldness gripped her spine. It was as if the house was pressing in on her, suffocating her with its ancient power. The whispers intensified, and now they weren't just urging her to open the book. They were demanding it. Read it. The words reverberated in her mind, echoing in every corner of her consciousness. It was no longer a request. It was an imperative. Despite herself, despite the growing terror gnawing at her, Emily's fingers brushed against the cover of the book. The moment she touched it, the world seemed to shift. The shadows in the room became more pronounced, their shapes contorting into monstrous forms that seemed to move just beyond her vision. The air thickened, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next choice. She could feel the weight of the book in her hand now, heavier than any object had the right to be. It was a weight of history, of dark knowledge, and of curses long forgotten. Against her better judgment, Emily opened the tome. As the first page turned, a wave of energy surged through her, coursing through her veins like ice water. The symbols on the pages seemed to writhe and pulse, as if they were alive. The whispers that had been so overwhelming before became a roar, their voices now filling her entire mind, drowning out everything else. She could no longer separate the sounds of her own thoughts from the voices within the book. They were one and the same. As she read the first few lines, the room around her began to distort. The walls seemed to bend, stretching and warping as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The basement, the chest, even the snow globe, all of it seemed insignificant now, swallowed by the ancient power that pulsed from the book. It was as if the house had been waiting for her to unlock this door, this truth. What she had thought was a relic was instead a gateway, a portal to something far worse than she had imagined. Her mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. What had she just unleashed? The language in the book, now more comprehensible, spoke of ancient rites, of spirits bound to this house, of sacrifices and awakenings. She could feel her heart pounding, her breath quickening as she read. The book was not just a source of knowledge. It was a call. It was calling forth something that had been dormant for centuries. She had opened a door that could never be closed again. Before she could process what she had done, the lights flickered, then went out entirely. The basement plunged into darkness, save for the faint, sickly glow that emanated from the book itself. Emily could feel a presence now, something cold and heavy, pressing in on her from all sides. It was no longer just the house. There were things here, in the shadows, that she could not see but could feel in the pit of her stomach. Something had awoken, and it was not content to be hidden any longer. It was coming for her, and there was no escape. The book had revealed its truth. There were things that had been buried in this house, things tied to the land, to the history, to the family that had once lived here. They had never truly left. They had only been waiting, biding their time, and now They were free, and Emily had unwittingly become their conduit. The room was suffocating. Emily could barely breathe as she sat in the dark, the book still open before her. The once unassuming basement had transformed into a place of ancient evil. The shadows, no longer content to merely creep along the edges of the room, now moved with a life of their own, pulsating and twisting like dark tendrils searching for something, someone. Emily's heart thudded in her chest, the rhythmic pounding matching the sinister pulse of the shadows. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. The silence was broken only by the soft rustling of the book's pages. As if guided by an unseen force, Emily's fingers flipped to the next page. She tried to resist, but it was as if the book had become an extension of herself, compelling her to read, to understand the horrors it contained. Each word seemed to burn into her mind. Images of ancient rites, sacrifices, and unspeakable entities flashing before her eyes. The more she read, the more she understood the terrible truth. The house was not merely haunted. It was a prison for the very things she was now awakening. The whispers, which had been faint murmurs before, now grew louder, no longer mere suggestions but clear commands. You must finish it. You must call them. Emily's breath quickened, her vision swimming as the room seemed to close in on her. She wanted to drop the book, to escape, but her hands remained frozen, her body rooted to the spot. The shadows encroached further, dark shapes moving with an intelligence that sent chills down her spine. They were watching her, waiting for her to complete the ritual she had unwittingly begun. For a moment, Emily considered fleeing, but the thought was quickly overshadowed by a deep, gnawing sense of dread. The door to the basement was still behind her, but it felt like miles away, as though the distance between her and escape had stretched impossibly. The house, the book, the shadows, they were all connected. The whispers were not just warnings. They were invitations. Come closer. It is time. You know what must be done. A cold breeze swept through the basement, and Emily shivered violently. The air was thick with something foul, a palpable sense of decay that seemed to seep into her very bones. As she glanced around, she saw something moving in the corner of her eye, a shape, dark and formless, darting just out of reach. She tried to turn toward it, but it was gone, slipping back into the shadows like a phantom. But she knew it was still there, lurking, watching. The house had become its own living entity, and Emily was its prey. The book's pages began to flutter on their own, as though some invisible hand were flipping through them. Emily tried to close the book, to shut it out, but it was no use. Her fingers moved of their own accord, tracing the ancient symbols that danced across the pages. The words were no longer in a language she could comprehend, but the meaning was clear. There was no escape. The ritual had begun, and it could not be undone. The shadows, the presence in the room, were merely the beginning. The true horror was far worse. As her eyes skimmed over the text, she found something that made her stomach twist with dread. The ritual, she realized, had been designed to awaken an ancient entity, a being that had been trapped in the house for centuries. It had been bound, imprisoned by the very people who had built the house, and it was now reaching out, clawing its way free. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized the entity was no mere ghost or specter. It was something far older, something that had never been human. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and the shadows seemed to grow larger, more pronounced. They were closing in on her. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away from the book, her mind racing for some way to stop what had begun. But it was too late. The entity's presence was growing stronger, its power radiating from the very walls of the house. It was alive now, and it wanted out. It wanted freedom, and Emily was the key to unlocking it. Her pulse quickened, and she felt an overwhelming compulsion to return to the book, to continue reading, to finish what had been started. The shadows in the room began to writhe and twist, their forms becoming more defined, taking on grotesque shapes, twisted faces, gnarled limbs, and eyes that glowed with an unholy light. They reached toward her, their fingers elongating, the air around them thick with malice. Desperation clawed at Emily, as she scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She needed to get out, needed to escape the suffocating grip of the house. But no matter how hard she tried to move, her body wouldn't obey. It was as if the house itself had ensnared her. It was now a part of her own. The shadows weren't just surrounding her. They were inside her, infecting her thoughts, urging her to continue. You cannot leave. You cannot escape. The words echoed in her mind, the voices of the house and its prisoner merging into a single, monstrous chorus. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emily forced herself to look away from the book. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the whispers, the shadows, the growing sense of doom that hung over her. But even with her eyes shut, she could feel the presence of the entity, its malignant force pressing against her mind, against her soul. She was trapped, and the longer she stayed in this house, the more she realized that there was no escape from the thing that had been awakened. In the darkness, the shadows continued to grow, and Emily could feel the weight of their gaze pressing down on her. She wasn't just a victim of the house anymore. She had become part of it, a vessel for the ancient evil that now roamed free. The ritual was only beginning, and as the shadows closed in, Emily understood with terrifying clarity that her fate was sealed. The tension in the house had reached a fever pitch. Every creaking floorboard, every gust of wind outside, seemed to carry with it an ominous warning. Emily could feel the entity in the walls, in the very air around her. It wasn't just a ghost or a lingering presence anymore. It was as if the house itself had become a living creature, an extension of the entity that had been freed. The shadows, no longer content to remain in the corners, had begun to stretch and twist with unnatural precision, moving towards her with purpose, like predators closing in on their prey. Emily could still hear the whispers. At first, they had been faint, like a soft murmur carried by the wind, but now they were deafening, rising and falling in a chaotic chorus. They came from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. The words were incomprehensible, but they didn't need to make sense. They were commands. Come closer. Finish what you started. It is almost time. The voice seemed to ripple through her, crawling into her mind, seeping into her thoughts. She was no longer in control of herself. She had become an instrument for the entity's will. The book, still lying open on the floor, called to her with a magnetic pull. Despite every instinct telling her to run, to throw the book away, she found herself drawn to it, as if an invisible force was compelling her to continue the ritual. Her fingers trembled as she reached down and flipped the pages. The symbols were becoming more intricate, more complex, and the words, they weren't even words anymore. They were images, shifting patterns that danced across the page in impossible ways. Emily couldn't look away. She felt as though if she did, the shadows would swallow her whole. But then, in the midst of the overwhelming dread, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight disturbance in the shadows, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. She blinked, trying to focus, but the shapes remained out of reach, as if mocking her. It was as though something was moving within the darkness, something that wasn't a part of the house, but something else entirely. She could feel its presence. It wasn't the entity that had been unleashed. It was something older, something far more ancient, and it was closing in. The house groaned, and the temperature dropped. Emily felt the chill in her bones, a deep, unnatural cold that spread from her feet up through her body. The shadows writhed around her like hungry serpents, but this new presence, the one she could barely comprehend, seemed to push back against them, pushing them to the edges of the room. The walls, once solid and unyielding, seemed to pulse with life. The house itself a living entity, holding something in the deepest recesses of its bowels. Emily's breath hitched as she realized the truth. The house had always been a prison, not for the entity she had freed, but for something far worse. The entity that had been released was only a part of a much larger nightmare. It was a herald, a messenger sent to wake the true horror that had been buried deep beneath the house. The whispers, the shadows, the book, everything had been leading to this moment. Emily's hands shook as the realization sank in. She was not just a victim. She had been chosen. She had been part of the plan all along. She was meant to be the one to break the seal, to awaken the horrors that had lain dormant for centuries. As the shadows began to recede, Emily saw something that made her heart race with terror. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief image in the darkness. But then it came into focus, and Emily's blood turned to ice. Standing in the corner of the room, just out of reach, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a face that was both human and inhuman at the same time. Its eyes, dark and empty, stared directly at her, and Emily felt as though it was looking into her soul, stripping away every layer of protection she had built around herself. The figure was not part of the shadows. It was something older, something that had been waiting. The figure raised one long, skeletal hand and pointed directly at her. The air seemed to crackle with electricity, and Emily could feel a force unlike anything she had ever known surge through her. Her body was no longer her own. It was as if her very cells were vibrating with the power of something ancient, something unfathomable. The house itself seemed to shake with the power of its awakening. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder than ever, rising into a cacophony of sound that rattled her bones. They were not coming from the book anymore. They were coming from the walls, from the very foundation of the house. She is the key. She is the one who will bring us all back. The words were no longer whispers. They were a roar, a maddening chant that filled the room and reverberated in Emily's skull. Her head throbbed with the force of it, and she could feel her sanity slipping away, bit by bit. As the figure in the corner took a step forward, the shadows began to gather once more, swirling around her like a storm. Emily's mind was a maelstrom of terror, her body trembling in the face of an unimaginable horror. The figure's steps were slow but deliberate, and with each one, the temperature in the room dropped even further. She could see her breath misting in front of her, a sign of the unnatural cold that had overtaken the house. And then it spoke. Its voice was not human, not even close. It was the sound of 1,000 voices, all speaking in unison, all speaking through her. "You have done well, child. The final piece is in place." The words echoed in her mind, a twisted lullaby that sent shivers down her spine. Emily's mouth went dry, her throat constricting as she realized the truth. The ritual was complete. The entity had been freed, but it wasn't alone. The horrors that had been imprisoned in the house were now free, and there was no escaping the nightmare that was about to unfold. The air in the house had become thick with malevolent energy. The walls, once passive and neutral, now seemed alive with motion, shuddering in time with the beating of Emily's heart. Each thump of her pulse felt like it echoed through the entire structure, amplifying the dread that seeped into every corner. It was no longer a house, it was a tomb, a place of imprisonment, and now of release. The figures that had lurked in the shadows before were now fully revealed, their grotesque forms twisting and shifting as though the very concept of form itself was foreign to them. Emily couldn't look away. She was caught, not just physically in the room, but mentally, unable to tear herself from the horror that unfolded before her. The figure that had revealed itself earlier, the one that towered over her with hollow eyes and impossibly long limbs, stood unmoving for a moment. It was watching her, waiting for something, or perhaps for her to make the next move. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to escape, but she knew that escape was not an option. The entity had bound her to this fate long ago. It had chosen her, and there was no turning back now. The air was suffocating, the temperature unbearable, and yet she couldn't breathe fast enough to outrun the cold that seemed to penetrate deep into her bones. The walls whispered again, not in the soft, seductive tones they had before, but with an intensity that made her body tremble. "It's time to finish what was started." The words coiled around her like a serpent, tightening, suffocating. The house, the entity, and the figure were all parts of a single whole, a machine whose gears were now clicking into place. Emily realized, with a dawning horror, that she was no longer in control of her own thoughts. The whispers were not simply suggestions. They were commands, urging her forward, nudging her toward her inevitable role in the unfolding nightmare. With each breath, the house seemed to grow darker. The shadows clung to her skin, to her clothes, to her very soul. She could hear movement now, too, scratching, slithering like something crawling beneath the floorboards. The figure was still there, silent and patient, but the air was alive with the sounds of something far worse. Emily could feel it in the pit of her stomach, an instinctual sense that the house was not simply haunted, it was cursed. This place had been a prison for far more than just the entity she had unleashed. It had been a prison for all the things that had been forgotten, buried deep in the earth, and they were waking up now. As the shadows reached out, she noticed the figure's lips twitch, as though it were smiling, but it was not a human smile. It was a grotesque stretching of something ancient, something predatory. "You have given them freedom, child," it said, its voice a cacophony of 1,000 tortured souls, reverberating in her skull. "You are the key, the final piece in the puzzle." The house groaned in response, and Emily could feel the weight of its age pressed down on her. The centuries of silence, suddenly shattering as the floor beneath her feet seemed to pulse with life. Emily's mind raced. She tried to resist, to find some shred of her former self that could stand against the overwhelming power that had taken hold of her. But the harder she fought, the stronger the grip became. She felt as if her very thoughts were being torn from her, shredded by invisible claws that raked through her consciousness. The whispers now became a chorus, louder, more insistent. "You cannot fight what you have already released. It is done. The pact is sealed." And then the figure stepped forward. It was not a single figure now, but a manifestation of many. The tall, skeletal being was joined by others, their forms not entirely human but still recognizably shaped. Their eyes, dark and hollow, stared into hers with an intensity that paralyzed her. There was something in them, something old, older than time itself. They moved as one, their bodies shifting and twisting in unnatural ways, their limbs jerking with a disturbing fluidity. The air was thick with their presence, and the house seemed to groan in response, the very foundation of the structure buckling under the weight of what had been released. For a moment, Emily wondered if she was dreaming. How could this be real? How could such horror exist in the world? But the cold, the darkness, the weight of their eyes upon her, it was all too real. She wanted to scream, to flee, but she knew that any attempt would be futile. She was bound to them now. She had released them, and there was no undoing it. As the figures circled around her, she felt a sharp, sudden pain in her chest. It was as if the shadows themselves were digging into her skin, pulling at her very soul. Her body trembled violently, her mind reeling as she tried to comprehend what was happening. The entity, the being that had been freed, had not been the only thing bound within the house. There had been others, creatures, entities, horrors far beyond human understanding, each of them waiting, watching, ready to return. In that moment, Emily realized that the house had been a holding pen for these beings, each one more terrifying than the last, and she had unwittingly unlocked their prison. The figure in the center, the leader of them all, spoke again, but this time its voice was not a whisper. It was a command, clear and resolute. "Now, child, you will bring us what we desire." And Emily, unable to fight any longer, nodded. She didn't want to. She didn't choose to. But in the face of their collective will, there was no resisting. The horror had already begun, and now there was no turning back. The house had reawakened, and with it, the unspeakable nightmares that had once been contained. As the figures drew closer, she understood the true nature of their hunger. It was not just the house that had been holding them. It was humanity itself, the essence of the living world that they craved. And she was the doorway through which they would once again emerge. The final seal had been broken, and all she could do now was watch as the nightmare unfolded, helpless in the face of its terror. And so, Emily, standing at the center of a house that was no longer just a house, realized the truth. She had not simply released these horrors, she had summoned them. The house that had once seemed like a mere vessel for Emily's nightmares was now a living, breathing thing. It pulsed with an unnatural energy, its walls vibrating with the rhythm of some terrible, unspoken ritual. The shadows, no longer confined to the corners, had extended their reach, swallowing the entire space in a thick, suffocating cloak. Every room felt the same, cold, heavy, and vibrating with a frequency that Emily could feel deep in her bones. It was as if the house itself had been transformed into the very heart of the horror it housed, and it now beat with an insatiable hunger for more. Emily, paralyzed by the realization that she was no longer in control, stood frozen. The figures, once distant and ethereal, now circled around her like predators, their movements synchronized, their eyes fixated on her with unblinking intensity. They were not human. They had never been human. The way they twisted and contorted in ways that defied nature made it clear that they were beings from a realm far beyond the physical. They existed on a plane of reality where human laws did not apply, and their form was as fluid and changeable as the darkness itself. The one that had spoken before, the leader, approached her now. Its form seemed to grow in size as it drew nearer, towering over her with an oppressive presence. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a nightmare of shifting shadows, with hollow eyes that seemed to devour the very light around them. Its mouth, a jagged slit in the center of its face, curved into a grin, if it could even be called a grin, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that were far too many for any human being. The smell of decay, of death, of something ancient and forgotten, wafted from it like a tangible force. Emily could feel the weight of its presence bearing down on her, as though it were crushing her spirit. "You have done well," the figure said, its voice a low, rumbling growl that resonated within her chest. There was no warmth to its words, no trace of gratitude, only a cold, detached recognition of her role in this macabre theater. "You have freed us, and now we are here. Now, we will take what is ours." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Emily wanted to scream, to plead for mercy, but she knew, deep down, that there would be no mercy. She had broken the seal, unwittingly or not, and now the price had to be paid. It was a price she could never have imagined, a price that went beyond her own life. These creatures, these horrors, had not been sealed away by accident. They had been banished for a reason. They were the nightmares of the world, the forgotten entities that had once ruled in darkness, feeding on fear, death, and the very essence of human life. And now, they had returned to claim what was theirs. Her mind raced, searching for any way to undo what had been done. Was there a way to reseal the house? To banish them again? Could she even escape? She had no answers. Only the crushing certainty that the house had become a prison, not just for her, but for all of humanity. She had opened the gate, and there was no going back. The price of awakening these creatures was far greater than her own soul. It was the price of the world itself. The leader, sensing her thoughts, leaned closer. Its voice was softer now, though no less terrifying. "Do you think you can stop us?" it asked, its breath foul and hot against her skin. "Do you think your fleeting hope, your fleeting strength, can halt what is inevitable?" The figure gestured to the others, its long, spindly fingers sweeping through the air as though commanding the very darkness to obey it. "We are the forgotten. We are the ancient. We are the shadows that humanity buried long ago. And now we rise, and we will take all that is ours." Emily could feel her knees growing weak, her heart pounding so violently in her chest that she could scarcely breathe. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in, the air growing heavier by the second. She had never felt so small, so insignificant. The darkness was alive, not just a force, but an entity unto itself, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling in its presence. But then, in a flicker of defiance, a thought emerged, a single, fleeting idea that cut through the fog of fear. If the house had been a prison for them, maybe there was still something, some way to contain them. Emily's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might be used against them, anything that might help her fight back. She didn't have much, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a chance. Her gaze fell on the walls. They were not ordinary walls. As she focused, she began to see the faint outlines of symbols, of patterns that had once been etched into the wood, faded with time but still present. She realized then that the house was not just a prison. It was a seal, a complex web of protections that had kept the horrors at bay. And the symbols, the markings on the walls, were the key to it all. The figure, sensing her shift in focus, gave a low, mocking laugh. "Do you think you can still fight us, child? The seal has already broken. There is no going back. There is no escape." But Emily refused to listen. The symbols were her only hope. They were the remnants of the old magic that had bound the house, the last vestiges of a forgotten protection that had been built to keep these horrors contained. If she could activate them, maybe, just maybe, she could undo the damage, reseal the house, and trap the creatures once again. Her fingers brushed the wall, tracing the ancient symbols, her mind working furiously to remember the words, the chants, the rituals that might restore the seal. It was a long shot, and she knew it, but it was all she had left. As her fingers moved over the symbols, the house seemed to react. The walls groaned, a low, ominous sound, and the temperature dropped even further. The darkness stirred, angry at being challenged. The creatures circled tighter around her, their movements becoming more erratic, their forms more monstrous. But Emily kept going, her fingers trembling but determined. If she could just... A searing pain shot through her arm. She gasped, stumbling back, her hand clutching her wrist. Something had dug into her skin. Something sharp, something alive. The leader stepped forward, its twisted grin widening. "You think you can undo what has been done?" it hissed. "The price has been paid, Emily. There is no undoing it. There is only the taking. Only the claiming of what is ours." Emily's vision blurred as the pain intensified, but in that moment she understood. There was no escape. There was no undoing the awakening. She had already lost. The price of awakening had been more than just the house. It was her soul. And the darkness, the ancient horrors, had already claimed it. The house had become an abyss, a place where light and life could not reach. The darkness had taken root, twisting everything it touched. Emily, still reeling from the painful realization that she had become an unwilling vessel for the horrors that had been released, felt herself drowning in the suffocating grip of despair. The leader, its grotesque form ever present, lingered close by, its voice a constant murmur of malicious promises. "There is no place for you now," it whispered, its words like cold fingers running across her skin. "You are ours. All of you. All of humanity. We are the end of all things." The creatures, now fully free from the confines of the house, were restless. They moved in a maddening blur, their shapes shifting constantly, as though they were only partially bound by the laws of the physical world. Emily could feel their eyes on her, cold, judgmental, their presence an unrelenting reminder that the world as she knew it was over. But amidst this chaos, her mind clung to one single, fleeting thought. She had to find a way to fight back. There had to be something, anything, that could stop them. She had felt the pull of the ancient symbols before. Perhaps they weren't entirely useless. Perhaps there was still a chance to undo the damage, to lock the monsters back where they came from. But even as she thought this, her body screamed in protest. The pain from the wound on her wrist throbbed with each beat of her heart, sending waves of nausea through her. It was as though the very act of her defiance had left a permanent mark on her, a signal to the creatures that they had successfully claimed her. They were no longer just in her mind. They were in her blood, in her flesh. They were everywhere. Yet, for all the overwhelming darkness that surrounded her, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something deeper at work. There was a flicker of something inside her, an ember of defiance that refused to be extinguished. It was as though, in the face of absolute despair, a final, desperate sliver of hope still clung to her soul. She wasn't sure where it came from or what it meant, but it was there, and it was enough to make her move. She stumbled toward the center of the room, away from the shifting, writhing forms of the creatures that continued to circle her like vultures. The air grew colder still, the shadows growing darker as she reached for the floor. Her fingers traced the surface, searching for the symbols she had felt earlier. They were still there, though they had begun to fade, as though the very act of touching them was threatening to erase them from existence. She had no time to waste. Her mind raced, trying to recall the ancient words, the incantations, the prayers that could possibly activate the seal. There was no guarantee that they would work, but she had no choice. If she was to die, she would at least go down fighting. The ground beneath her trembled, and the creature's laughter echoed through the house, a guttural sound that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. "You cannot escape," the leader said, its voice like a distant thunderclap. "You are a part of us now. The world you knew is gone. There is no hope. There is only us." Despite the terror threatening to overwhelm her, Emily continued. She focused, pushing aside the fear that threatened to paralyze her, and pressed her hand into the symbols. The moment her skin made contact, a shock ran through her body. For a brief instant, the world seemed to crack, and a rush of energy surged through her, as if the house itself had awakened in response to her touch. Her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps, as she felt the energy within her intensify. It was as though she had become the conduit for something ancient, something powerful. The symbols began to glow faintly, their light illuminating the room in a dim, eerie glow. For a moment, Emily thought she saw the shadows recoiling, as if the very presence of the light was enough to make them retreat. But it was only a brief illusion. The darkness, ancient and patient, would not be so easily repelled. "You cannot win," the leader growled, its voice filled with a venomous certainty. "This world is ours now. You are too late." Emily's fingers tightened around the symbols, her determination growing stronger with each passing second. Her body felt as though it were being torn apart, the energy coursing through her veins like fire. But it wasn't just her pain that kept her going. It was the thought of everything she had left behind, everything she had fought for. There was still something in her that refused to give up, something that clung to the memory of a world that was full of life, of warmth, of love. She wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The energy continued to build, surging out of her and into the very bones of the house. The shadows twisted, writhed, and began to shriek in a collective frenzy. The creatures that had once seemed so invincible, so all-consuming, now seemed to hesitate, their movements becoming erratic and uncoordinated. For the first time, Emily saw fear in their eyes, fear of the very thing they had awakened, fear of the power they had underestimated. "Impossible," the leader spat. "You are only delaying the inevitable." But Emily was no longer listening to the voice. Her mind was focused solely on the task at hand. She had become the living vessel for the last flicker of hope, and she would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The energy was reaching its peak now, and she could feel the power surging around her like a tidal wave. She could hear the whispers of the past, the voices of those who had sealed the house away in the first place. They were calling to her, guiding her, helping her push through the agony. With one final, desperate push, Emily uttered the incantation, the word she had barely remembered, but that now seemed to flow effortlessly from her lips. The house trembled again, this time more violently, as if it were being torn apart at its very foundations. The shadows screamed, a deafening wail of agony and rage that shook the walls and rattled the windows. The creatures writhed and contorted in pain, their forms flickering like broken images on a screen. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the house fell silent. The energy in the room dissipated, and the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted. The creatures, once so terrifying, were gone, banished, sealed away once again in whatever dimension they had come from. The house, though still cold, no longer pulsed with the same malevolent energy. It felt almost peaceful, as though a storm had passed. Emily collapsed to the floor, exhausted, her body trembling from the ordeal. She had no idea if the creatures were truly gone or if they would return, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The world was not yet lost. There was still time to rebuild, to heal, and maybe, just maybe, time to find the light again. In the aftermath of the battle, the house that once pulsed with malevolent energy now stood still. Emily, her body bruised and battered from the intense struggle, barely had the strength to lift her head. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths, the exhaustion of the ritual weighing heavily on her. She looked around the room, where the remnants of the dark energy lingered faintly, like a distant echo. It was as if the house itself had taken a deep, reluctant breath, letting go of its toxic grip on the world. For a moment, Emily allowed herself the luxury of believing the worst was over. She had succeeded in banishing the creatures, or so it seemed. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air for days had lifted, and the oppressive silence that followed was almost too much to bear. There was no longer any whispering in the shadows, no more strange noises in the walls. The house felt almost empty, as though it had been hollowed out by its own darkness. But even in the stillness, something gnawed at her, a creeping feeling that there was more to this victory than she had understood. As Emily struggled to sit up, a strange sensation washed over her, a coldness that was not natural. It wasn't the chill of the house, but something deeper, something within her. The energy she had tapped into, the forces that had coursed through her veins, had not left her entirely. Instead, they seemed to have settled inside her, lying dormant but ever present. She could feel them, coiled tightly, just beneath the surface of her skin, like a slow-burning fire waiting to erupt. She knew, deep down, that whatever had happened in that room had irrevocably changed her. She stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, and walked to the window. The night outside was quiet, the snow falling softly in the still air. The world looked peaceful, untouched by the horrors she had just experienced. But as her eyes lingered on the soft blanket of white covering the ground, she noticed something unsettling. The snow wasn't quite right. It was too still, too perfect, as though it had been frozen in time. The trees, too, stood eerily unmoving, their branches heavy with snow, but not bending beneath its weight. It was as if the world outside had become a mere reflection of the stillness inside the house, caught in a moment of suspended animation. Emily's heart began to race as a realization slowly dawned on her. The creatures were gone, but had the world truly returned to normal? Or was something else at play here? She turned away from the window, her thoughts spiraling. Could it be that the house had not only manipulated her mind, but had also altered the very fabric of reality itself? Was it possible that, in her attempt to seal away the horrors, she had unwittingly sealed away time itself? The questions gnawed at her, but there were no answers, only a creeping sense of dread that began to settle over her once more. The house, once an ancient prison for unspeakable forces, now seemed like a monument to a past long forgotten. But the feeling of being watched had returned. The walls no longer felt like mere walls. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as though the house itself was alive, breathing slowly, methodically. Emily could sense its presence in every corner, in the very air she breathed. It was as if the house had become part of her, intertwined with her own soul, an extension of her very being. She moved through the house, her mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. She had succeeded in driving the creatures away, but was she free of them? Or had she merely begun another chapter in their twisted game? The symbols that had once glowed with power now lay dormant, their meaning lost to her. But as she passed the old fireplace, something caught her eye, something that hadn't been there before. It was faint, barely perceptible, but the mark on the stone appeared to have shifted. The symbols, once burned into the surface of the fireplace, now seemed to writhe, as though they were alive, struggling to escape the confines of the stone. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This was not right. The symbols had been sealed away, or so she had thought. Yet here they were again, in a new form, a darker form. They pulsed with a soft, eerie glow, their power far more potent than before. She reached out instinctively, but stopped herself just in time. She had learned that touching the symbols had consequences, and she was no longer certain she could control the forces they represented. The realization hit her like a cold slap. The creatures had not been banished. They had merely been given a new form, a new vessel to inhabit. She wasn't free. She had only delayed the inevitable. The world outside had frozen, suspended in a strange limbo, and now the house had become a breeding ground for something even darker. The leader, the creature that had haunted her every step, had not been destroyed. It had simply found a new way to reach her. Its presence was now more insidious, more dangerous, because it was no longer bound by the physical limitations of the house. Emily stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of her failure crashed down on her like an avalanche. She had thought that her actions had sealed the darkness away for good, but the truth was far more horrifying. The creatures, the entity that had whispered in her mind, were still here, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to strike. They had always been here, lurking just beyond the veil, biding their time. And now, Emily realized with growing dread, it was only a matter of time before they returned, stronger, more powerful than before. The last flicker of hope she had clung to flickered and died in that moment, leaving her with nothing but the crushing weight of inevitability. The creatures were never truly gone, and she was never truly free. The war was far from over. It had only just begun. The air on Christmas Eve was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones and refuse to leave. The world outside remained still, unnaturally so. Snow continued to fall, a perfect blanket covering the earth in white, but the stillness was oppressive, suffocating. Emily stood by the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she watched the snowflakes dance in the air, frozen in their descent, as if time itself had become trapped in this moment. It was as though the world, much like her, was waiting for something to break the silence, to shatter the uneasy calm that had enveloped everything. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the past few days in a chaotic blur. She had thought she had defeated the darkness. She had thought she had freed herself from its grasp. But the truth was far more harrowing. The forces that had haunted her, that had twisted her reality and manipulated her mind, had only grown stronger. The rituals, the symbols, the ancient power she had tried to banish, none of it had worked. The creatures, the entity, were still here, still watching her from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. She turned away from the window, her body stiff with the weight of the realization that the final confrontation was upon her. There would be no more escape, no more hiding from the horrors that had been unleashed. The house, once a place of refuge, now felt like a tomb, the walls closing in on her with each passing second. The faint whispers had returned, their voices low and insistent, weaving in and out of her thoughts, taunting her with the knowledge that there was no salvation. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. Emily could feel the temperature drop even further, the air growing thick with the sense of something malevolent drawing near. She stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate, her heart pounding in her chest. The symbols on the walls, once dormant, now seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy, their shapes shifting and twisting as though they were alive, mocking her futile attempts to understand them. Then, she heard it, the sound of something moving in the darkness. It was soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but it quickly grew louder, more pronounced. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned, her eyes scanning the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and bend, twisting in ways that defied logic. There, in the corner of the room, a figure began to take shape, its form indistinct at first, like smoke swirling in the dim light. But as it materialized fully, Emily recognized the figure standing before her. It was him, the leader, the one who had haunted her every step, the one who had manipulated her thoughts and driven her to the brink of madness. His eyes gleamed with an otherworldly malice, and his grin was twisted, cruel. He took a step toward her, his presence suffocating the air around them, and Emily felt the weight of his power pressing down on her, almost physically. She could feel the dark energy swirling in the room, pushing against her skin, trying to invade her mind, to break her once and for all. For a moment, Emily froze. Fear surged through her veins, but this time, it was different. This time, she was not the same person who had stumbled into this house all those days ago. She had learned, she had fought, and she had survived. The darkness had tried to break her, but she had resisted. She had resisted long enough to understand that this was not just a fight for her life. It was a fight for the very fabric of reality itself. She could no longer afford to run. She could no longer afford to hide. The entity before her spoke, his voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You cannot escape. You are mine. You have always been mine." His words curled around her like smoke, suffocating her with their meaning. "You cannot fight what is already inside you." But Emily did not falter. She reached into the depths of her mind, pulling from the strength she had gained in the trials she had endured. She had learned the rituals, the incantations, and now, in this moment, she was ready to confront the darkness head-on. She spoke the words she had never dared to utter before, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. "I am not yours," she declared, her words ringing out with a newfound clarity. "You cannot control me anymore." The room seemed to vibrate with the force of her declaration. The figure in front of her recoiled, his grin faltering for just a moment. Emily felt a surge of power within her, a warmth that spread through her chest and down to her fingertips. The darkness that had once claimed her began to push back, its hold loosening as her will strengthened. She could feel the ritual, the energy she had tapped into, swirling around her, forming a protective barrier. The symbols on the walls flared with light, casting the room in an ethereal glow. The entity shrieked, a sound that shattered the stillness of the house. The walls trembled, the ground beneath Emily's feet shaking as though the very foundation of the house was being torn apart. The dark figure writhed in agony, his form distorting and flickering like a dying flame. Emily's heart raced as she pressed forward, her voice rising in a chant that she had learned long ago. With each word, the creature weakened, its power slipping away, until finally, with one final cry, it was gone. The room fell silent once more, but this time, the silence was different. It was a peaceful quiet, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. Emily collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she knew in her heart that the battle was over. The darkness had been vanquished. For good, she had won. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but now it seemed less like a frozen prison and more like a blanket of peace. The world, once frozen in time, had started to move again. The house, now free from the malignant influence that had haunted it for so long, seemed to breathe with a new life. Emily stood slowly, her body sore, but her spirit unbroken. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. As she walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered landscape, a quiet smile played on her lips. She had survived, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt free. Free from the shadows, free from the whispers, and free from the house that had once tried to claim her soul. It was Christmas Eve, and the world had been reborn.